more than 40% of the world's borders have been drawn by England, Britain, and France. Okay, so this is the same thing. So after World War I, there was what was called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, where basically France and Britain divided up the spoils that they got from the Turks when they, when the Ottoman Empire was beaten. And they had done a polling of the people in the region. Now, the region that I'm talking about is Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Jordan, part of Iraq, part of Saudi Arabia. Like it's this region. It's what Israel is trying to build as Greater Israel. But that region of peoples after World War I were actually polled, and they specifically polled Christians, Jews, and Muslims. Okay, so keep this in mind. Jews were polled, and the majority of all of those people wanted to be what would have been called Greater Syria, and which really makes the most sense because those people are really the same peoples. They speak the similar languages. I mean, that would make more sense regardless of religion. And instead, Britain and France were like, no, we cannot give that big of a territory to the brown people so that they can oversee themselves. We can't do that. We have to control it. And the only way to control it is to cut it up in a way that causes animosity, major tribal wars. And they did it that way to maintain control of the area. But so, yeah, those people wanted to be Greater Syria. And yet that was not what was in the cards.
This is what was in the cards after all.
World War I didn't just destroy old empires. It created a vacuum, and the powers who filled it did so with treaties, betrayals, and borders that would ripple through the next century. Enter the Arabs. Many Arab leaders, particularly Sharif Hussein of Mecca, had long chafed under Ottoman rule. The British saw an opportunity. In a series of secret letters between 1915 and 1916, known as the McMahon-Hussein Correspondence, the British promised Hussein an independent Arab kingdom if he led a revolt against the Ottomans. Arab fighters, including the now iconic Lawrence of Arabia, joined the effort. They blew up trains, attacked supply lines, and fought a guerrilla war alongside British forces, all the while believing that after the war they would rule themselves. But there was a problem. Even as Britain promised the Arabs independence, it was cutting a very different deal. In 1916, the British and French drew up a secret agreement, known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement. It was named after the two diplomats who drafted it, Sir Mark Sykes of Britain and François-Georges Picot of France. This agreement carved up the Ottoman Empire into British and French spheres of influence. France would control modern-day Syria and Lebanon. Britain would take modern-day Iraq, Jordan, and a strong influence over Palestine. The Arabs would get nothing. This agreement wasn't public at the time. The Arab leaders fighting for their freedom had no idea that, behind their backs, European powers were already dividing the spoils. And then came a leak. When the Bolsheviks took power in Russia, they exposed the agreement to the world. Arab leaders were furious. As if double-dealing the Arabs wasn't enough, Britain made yet another promise during the war. In 1917, Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour wrote a letter expressing British support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people.
And that's how it came to be. With the backing of the Rothschilds, the Balfour Declaration ultimately became the genocidal fake state of Israel that really is the state of Palestine, and will hopefully one day be again. But it's safe to say that if there is an inflection point in terms of how this happened, it had nothing to do with the Holocaust. The Holocaust was used as a backdrop to make it happen.
But here, the case in point with this right here is that essentially they promised the same land first to the Arabs of the region. They promised that group the land because they were going to help them against the Ottoman Empire. So these were the people that were natives in that region that they were willing to sell out their own people to get ahead. It's just like we have today, just like we were just talking about with Sabi. It's the same thing. So this land was promised to the Muslims, and it was promised to the Jews. right around this, actually promised to the Muslims first, then promised to the Jews. But yes, that's the predicament that we see right here.
This was the Balfour Declaration. It was one sentence, but it changed everything. The letter was addressed to Lord Rothschild, a leader in the British Jewish community, and it was meant to gain support from Zionist Jews in Britain and America for the war effort. But here's the catch. Britain had now promised the same land to two different groups. To the Arabs, they had promised independence across the Middle East, including Palestine. To the Jews, they promised a national home in that very same land. This contradiction would set the stage for over a century of conflict. The war ended, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and the victors began to reshape the region. Rather than granting independence, the League of Nations established mandates, a polite term for colonies. Britain took control of Palestine, Transjordan, and...
Just look at that. Just look at that map. Just look at how these places just became completely divided, which is why you hear things like French Arabic. I know I have. That's where it comes from. That's how these areas, that's why so many English-speaking Indians, for example. And
yeah, if you look at where French mandate Syria is, and you come around and cut off like that sort of portion of Iraq, and it comes down through that portion of Saudi Arabia, and it's like almost like a circle that goes around up through the Sinai and around Palestine, that would have been Greater Syria.
Yeah.
Yeah, but then they drew these lines. And by the way, I'd like to point out that if you all want to know who gets screwed in all of this all the time, every which way, is the Kurds. That is what I know, because the Kurds were promised their own nation, and yet they got divided amongst 4 different countries in this region where they would be a minority and persecuted in each one of those. So I'm just like, a lot of people got screwed from this.
Iraq. France took Syria and Lebanon. These mandates were presented as a form of stewardship. In practice, they were outright imperial control. Arab revolts broke out in Syria, Iraq, and Palestine. The British and French crushed them. This wasn't just a betrayal of promises, it was the institutionalization of a lie. The people of the region were told they weren't ready to rule themselves, that they needed guidance, civilization. What many received instead were broken promises, foreign-backed regimes, and decades of unrest. The image of Western nations as liberators began to unravel. What had started as political resentment grew into something deeper, generational disillusionment. One of the most enduring legacies of this era was the drawing of modern borders. These borders often had no relation to ethnic, religious, or tribal realities on the ground. They split communities and forced others together. Iraq, for instance, lumped together Sunni Arabs, Shia Arabs, and Kurds under a single British-backed monarchy.
You don't think that's going to cause problems?
See, this is what I was talking about. The Kurds. Why is everybody always hating on the Kurds? I have been hearing about hating on the Kurds like my entire adult life. And it's like, it was done so purposefully. And they did it. And when you see what they did in Syria, is they took 4 different groups, essentially, and they took the group, the Alawites, that were actually not the majority, and put them in charge. And it's like, we really like wreaked havoc. By we, I mean Western Empire. We really wreaked havoc. Like, this is, it's all why we're in the position we're in. This is why we're in the mess that we're in West Asia.
You know, the one thing I always find interesting, because I've been noticing some comments from Scott Farkas, if that's even your real name, or Fardas, if that's what you probably go by. He who wins the fight draws the lines. It is how it is how it's always will be. Well, here's the thing.
It doesn't work.
Well, here's the one thing. I will say this, Scott. Is that in truth how it actually works? Yes. But the people that comment like you do, that say that, are never the ones that are actually doing the fighting and putting their lives on the line. That's just how it is. And so now we have this. Judea was listed on the maps as recently as 1918, when it was a province of the Ottoman Empire. Again, you know, look, this stuff is just made up. Just like we have decided that we're going to draw a map in Iraq, aka Mesopotamia, and make it so that people actually want to kill each other, which is essentially what's happened. There is a difference between Shia and Sunni. And that's where the whole dividing lines within Iraq has happened. That's why there's been so much fighting in this nation for several generations. But why is the fighting? Why do these things occur? Because in the end, it's all about money and power. It's all about resources. And whether it's France, Britain, or us, this is how it is.
Yeah.
So the deep-seated hatred for the Muslims in particular is very real.
Syria was split into multiple sectarian states before being jammed back together. Lebanon was carved out specifically to give Maronite Christians a majority. These were not borders created for stability. They were borders created for convenience, for control. And they created pressure cookers that would explode again and again throughout the 20th century. The consequences of these lies are still playing out to this day. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is perhaps the most visible and enduring legacy of Britain's conflicting promises. The 1917 Balfour Declaration supported the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, a region where the vast majority of the population was Arab.
Oops. I guess that's a little bit of...
And here's the point, like people saying things like, to the victor goes the spoils. Like, I understand the premise of that, but if the spoils are going to do nothing but be the bane of your existence for eternity, is that really a win? Like, it's only a win for the capitalists that make money off of all of this. That's the only people it's a win for. And it just seems like a really stupid plan. It's a stupid plan.
Well, now we're seeing the after effects of such almost well over a century later.
Population was Arab. At the same time, Britain had already promised Arab leaders that they would support Arab independence, including in Palestine, if they revolted against the Ottomans. These contradictory pledges created deep confusion and resentment. When the British Mandate took over after World War I, the influx of Jewish immigrants, many fleeing anti-Semitic violence in Europe, accelerated. Tensions between Jewish and Arab communities escalated into violence. Arab uprisings were met with brutal crackdowns. British authorities found themselves caught in a trap of their own making, unable to appease either side. This unresolved conflict would eventually explode into civil war, the creation of Israel in 1948, and the ongoing struggle that continues to dominate Middle Eastern politics today. Before European intervention, identities in the Ottoman Middle East were often defined more by religion, tribe, or locality than by national borders.
Yes.
But the Sykes-Picot Agreement and later mandates carved the region into artificial states with little regard for ethnic or sectarian realities.
Now, who would do something like that? Or what would be the motive to do such a thing?
Maintain control and foment discord. I mean, that's really the point of it. You divide up all the people so that they can't have any sort of unification. They can't have any power. They can't control their own resources. They can't do anything. And you put your little tools, you pick a family, some rich oil family, and you crown them the kings of their different kingdoms, and you give them Jordan and Saudi Arabia, and you just hand those things over like that. And then you just have tools in the region for eternity that hand it down to their children. And you basically govern by monarchy in West Asia. That's what we've been doing.
Jen, Infamous Eli is a regular viewer of our show. So I figured this is actually a reasonable question for somebody who, is a Black American versus a Jewish American, knowing this understanding about the Rothschilds and whether or not this is a direct correlation to why fervent we got to stop saying anti-Semitism because the word it's completely juxtaposed.
Right, it's anti-Jew.
Hatred. Yes.
Yeah, hatred towards Jews.
I would agree that the Rothschilds in particular bear a significant amount of responsibility as to why that is the case. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, Rothschild and other notable oligarchic, powerful people throughout history, I think that's definitely part of it. It's definitely lends itself to a certain stereotype. And I've said this before, that the reason that Jews were bankers and did the things that they did in terms of like livelihood is they weren't allowed to do other things. They weren't allowed. They had quotas on Jews going to medical school, on Jews going to law school. They weren't allowed in certain industries. They weren't allowed to get certain licenses. So what they learned was they could make money lending money.
Usury.
Well, yes. And so while I do know that there is definitely a negative stereotype with that, also know that there weren't other options in a lot of cases. So it sort of, that's what led to Jews being in charge of the banking and the money and stuff. Yeah, that was the only way they could make money because they weren't allowed to do anything else. So it's kind of, it's a sordid history. But yeah, I think Rothschild and people like that are definitely lend itself to people believing that there's the Jewish conspiracy. But you just know that there are very many, if not most, people that are Jewish that are working class people. Is true. Like, I come from very working class, if not low income Jewish people. I was the first person in my family to go to college. I mean, I've told my story before, but yeah, most of Jewish people are not the Rothschilds. They're people that fled the pogroms from, like my family fled the pogroms from Russia at the turn of the last century. So it's just different. Yeah.
And much like another channel that we collaborate with from time to time is Due Dissonance. You know, Keaton and Russell are both from working class Jewish backgrounds. They are adamant about their support for Palestine. So it is imperative that we continue to address this because, again, the goal of the Zionist project is to always conflate Judaism and Zionism. There cannot be a separation, otherwise Zionism will die. And that is our goal.
Iraq, for example, was stitched together from three very different Ottoman provinces: a Sunni center, a Shiite south, and a Kurdish north. Syria, too, was a patchwork of religious and ethnic groups, from Alawites and Druze to Christians and Sunni Arabs. Colonial powers didn't just draw the borders, they also picked favorites.
See?
And in case you're wondering who the gentleman is all the way on the right, is the worst president in the history of the United States, in my opinion, of course, and that's Woodrow Wilson.
In Iraq, the British installed a Sunni monarchy over a Shiite majority, sowing deep divisions. In Syria, the French empowered minority groups like the Alawites to help control the majority, which only intensified resentment and distrust. These decisions laid the groundwork for future coups, civil wars, and sectarian violence. The power struggles in modern Iraq and Syria are not just modern issues. They are echoes of borders that never fit the people forced to live inside them. These aren't just historical footnotes. They are the structural foundations of modern geopolitics in the Middle East. When people ask why there is so much instability in the region, the answer is often made to seem simple: tribalism, extremism, oil. But the deeper truth is far older. It's written in old telegrams, secret maps, and imperial deals.
And that's it.
So, yeah, I mean, Western Empire created this mess.